Good afternoon, everyone. This will be the first of 3 videos I'm going to make that will cover the first 2 modules this week, the next 2 next week, and then the final modules 5 and 6 in anticipation of the midterm test. Because this is the compressed course, we are going to have to move very quickly through this material. So what I've done for myself and hopefully for you is try to condense all of the main ideas onto one page. I like lists. I like to sort of reduce information to its most salient points, and that's kind of what I've done here. So what I want to do in this video, and I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I can. I'm going to go for 15-20 minutes at the most, but I'm also going to leave these videos posted. So when you want to go back and sort of refresh your memory on some of these ideas, because there are a lot of things covered in each of the modules, hopefully interesting, but certainly you want to know, okay, what's the really important stuff I need to remember? That's what I want to do in these videos. So I will keep all of these posted, this one, the one for next week and the week after, and we'll cover what's called the salient points. Okay, so let's scroll down here, and the first thing we wanted to talk about in week 1 or module 1 is language, thought, and philosophy in ancient Athens. And the first question typically is, why are we looking at these old dead white guys, right, from Greece? Well, because there's something that they offer to us today, and we look at it and say that the thinkers and philosophers of ancient Athens really represent the starting point of Western civilization. And they do it in the 3 following manners. They present to us the beginnings or the seeds or the germ, however we want to describe it, of legal and political institutions. They also begin a body of scientific and philosophical knowledge, as well as technical achievements. Archimedes' screw, if you've ever worked in a factory, a conveying screw device, that's Archimedes. That's a 2,500-year-old device. It still works just fine. And so, along with legal and political institutions, body of scientific and philosophical knowledge, and technical achievements, this third one is particularly important. And that is establishing a relationship between political freedom, technological advancements, and the exercise of reason as being essential to the creation of knowledge. If one of those is missing, then you are going to be working under difficult conditions, especially the idea of political freedom. These days we talk about intellectual freedom as well. Without that, it becomes very difficult to create new bodies of knowledge. Okay, so once we're into this era and we're thinking about what they are achieving, one thing we need to remember is that reason and objectivity are absolutely essential in achieving any of the goals that we have established for ourselves in the Western world. Now, what does that mean? That means that at the time that we're studying here, around the 5th and 4th century, this is a time of the end of the Pre-Socratics, the beginning of Plato and Aristotle, but there was obviously a time before. And reason and objectivity at the time of Plato and Aristotle and the Pre-Socratics, absolutely important. But prior to the ancient Athenians thinking and having their being, as they say, reason actually lacked independence from religion and mythology, as well as any kind of higher status that it may have had in order to challenge some of the ideas that were inherent in mythological and religious thinking. So prior to the ancient Athenians, reason was tangled up or interdependent with mythology and reason, but the period that we're looking at is the beginnings of the untanglement or the disentanglement of reason as an independent entity to be used along with objectivity to study the world. So along with being the starting point of Western civilization, in particular, there is also the beginning of what are called written laws from the 7th century. So this would be 600 BC. And this is very important because it leads to the political development of the city-state, or what's called the polis. And with these new codes that are, of course, written, conceived, written, and then laid down by, unfortunately, landowning male members of the community. And the reason for that is because they figure that they were the only ones that would directly be affected by any changes in the codes. So in a very kind of simplistic way, we can understand why they think this way, but certainly it wasn't fair. But fairness was not something that was important back then. Justice as balance was more important than justice as fairness, something we've now sort of created and keep very sacred. So the appearance of these written laws, written by landowning males, really represents something, because these are laws, impartial laws, that were laid down and deliberately chosen by individuals, by men, rather than gods, rather than pagan gods, theological entities of one sort or another. These are deliberately chosen and created by the community, by the population. Now, it's not democracy in the modern sense of the word as we call it, but it is the self-created beginning. This is the beginning of democracy, however poor and inferior it may be, but there it is. And because of the beginnings of democracy and political institutions, the need for debate to discuss some of these matters, the legal matters, political matters, again, pushed philosophy to the forefront. Because in order to create these laws, you have to be able to discuss them in some reasonable manner. And this is where philosophy really kind of came into its own. Now, prior to this era, now we're talking only 150 years roughly, not previously like 1000 BC, but closer around the 8th and 7th century, but the 7th to the 6th in particular, we have what's called Pre-Socratic Thought. And the Pre-Socratic thinkers are those individuals who look into key areas, right, of what they consider to be worth inquiring, be the cosmos, right, primary stuff of the universe. These monistic thinkers, such as Thales, that considered water to be that one universal substance that you would find anywhere. Anaximander talked about the epeiron, right, this life force that is everywhere. Each one of them came up with a different and unique proposition regarding that single substance. So that kind of thinking about the cosmos, thinking about being, ontology is ideas about being, and the structure and the function of the human soul. All of these ideas, these aspects, these areas of interest, we'll say, are all part of this phenomenon called human knowledge. And from human knowledge, we derive morality and ethics, scientific knowledge, legal knowledge, philosophical and political, and so on. But what is remarkable about pre-Socratic thinking, over and above their exploration of the natural world, is that their kind of thinking represents the earliest Greek philosophical writings, many of which are now lost, that at least attempt to create natural explanations of these otherwise considered mythological phenomena. Tides, a thunderstorm, some cataclysmic event, shadows and the ability to tell time, or the measurements, or all these various things that are attempts to find laws that are inherent in nature, right? That govern the development of nature. This is what pre-Socratic thought is all about. And so that's kind of what I want to say. They looked at the cosmos, primary stuff of the universe, the human soul, and these underlying principles governing the world as we could see it. And of course, they were natural philosophers, but the first thing they did was dig underneath, right? What's going on behind there? What are some predictions we can make? And predictions here would be governing laws. Now, they were also trying to fool themselves into thinking that there was something that was not only reliable but predictable, and it was the way in which they made sense of the world and made sense of the chaos of nature. That becomes really important in the second module. So let's leave that right there for now. Now, the last two people of interest would be Plato and Aristotle. Plato's theory of forms, sometimes it's a rather kind of daunting notion, like theory of forms. I don't get it. Plato discovered ideas. That's literally what he did. Now, not ideas about things in the sense of, I didn't think of that before, but ideas as perennial, ahistorical, eternal forms. So if you think of Plato's theory of ideas rather than theory of forms, it might make it a little easier to understand. And Plato thought that the material world was not the real world that we should be studying, because it ebbs and flows, it comes into being and dies away, it's corruptible, it's not reliable, we shouldn't rely on our senses. And he said, no, what's truer, what's more real, are these ideas about the world. So what he's really thinking about are kind of universals, right? The idea, universal of chair or dog or earth or whatever. So Plato put his store in the perennial and an ahistorical notion of an idea. It will never be corrupted. In other words, what we consider to be geometry in 2023 is what Plato and Pythagoras and others would have also considered to be geometry in 432 BC. It doesn't change. It is eternal. And Plato looked at ideas in much the same way. Compared to the physical world that is corrupted, the metaphysical world of forms or ideas is eternal. And that is what is the more real or the truer aspect of our existence. So his writings, his dialogues, speak about ideas, archetypes, and abstract ideas such as justice, truth, beauty. Because when you think about it, we can identify something that is beautiful, but we have a lot more trouble identifying what beauty is. Right? Here's an example of beauty. But what is beauty? And that's what Plato would do. What is this idea that we discuss and really don't have a clear idea of what it is? We recognize it, we can see it in the world, but what is that thing we discuss? So that is what Plato tries to do. And because of that, he's considered an idealist. So an idealist is a person that deals, of course, in ideas. It doesn't mean that he loves the best of everything. He's an idealist in the sense that he filters the real world, the known world, through ideas and is able to sort of match up the real world to the idea that he has. And of course, it's typically left wanting, right? Because ideas are perfect and the material world is close enough. The other thinker is Aristotle. And Aristotle seems to be a bit more practical rather than theoretical. Now, he's considered a materialist, but he certainly did apply some theoretical knowledge to his observations. So he's not a pure materialist, but he was certainly much more practical than Plato. And he talked about virtuous behavior as being necessary for the community. He worked extensively on ethics. He wrote political philosophy, such as politics is what it's called. And his ideas about the polis as a very naturally defined and derived community. People like to be with one another. And a community that is a really good community is one in which everyone feels not only that they are participating in it, but they can bring the best that they can be to the table. So this idea of a polis, right, this community, is in fact even more important than the family. It's one thing to be part of a family, but he says it's even better and even more important to be part of a community. So that's essentially week 1, module 1, and we're at 13 minutes, so we're not doing too badly. Okay, so week 2, we take a little bit of a flip and we kind of look at the opposite of that same period, and that is the return of the irrational. And this is some really interesting stuff in my studies using the work of Cornelius Castoriadis in particular, because many of these ideas are presented here. And some of the anthropologists and archaeologists that have worked on the ancient world, I find some of this stuff really fascinating because it casts ancient Athens in a very different light. Now, what is that light? Let's take a look at it. Okay. So we've established now that rational thought and reason and objectivity begin in the 6th century in the various Greek cities around Asia Minor, which is basically just on the west coast of Turkey and Iran, Iraq, somewhere in that area. And what's happening in this particular area in Asia Minor and these various Greek cities is a kind of positivist view, all right, a reflection that relies on scientific evidence concerning nature. This is where it starts. So it isn't mythology. It isn't what the gods and goddesses say. It's a positive scientific view of the world using scientific evidence, of course, primitive forms of science, no microscopes or telescopes, no sextants, no devices of any sort. Just basically a vision of the world and then thought about that world. So there's a new positive view of kind of a reflective mode regarding the material world, and that becomes the birth of philosophy because it is the beginning of scientific thought and especially of thought itself, the discovery or the realization that we have thoughts and we can think about things. And so from that, philosophy is born, the discovery of ideas. So logos, right, which is this rational principle that is evident in the universe, whether it's called natural laws, universal laws, monadic laws, right, a single substance, these are all guided and governed by logos, which is this rational principle that is believed to exist in the world. Now, it's freed for the very first time from mythology and from theology, and it was by the Pre-Socratics. So they really set the stage for the beginnings of philosophy as we know it with Plato and Aristotle. So this event, right, this disentangling of reason from mythology is the result of a single and decisive revelation, the discovery of the mind. The fact that we have a mind that we can use to think about the world and formulate unique perspectives and ideas about it, and then persuade others that our vision of the world is an interesting one and worth considering. All of this starts at that particular time. So we could conceivably say that the Athenians invented philosophy. Now, typically when I teach this, I also stop and say, okay, the ancient Athenians are considered to have invented philosophy, but they were really good listeners. And what they listened to were the ideas that belonged to other peoples, because there were so many other cultures around this time: Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Persian, so many different cultures, each with their own formulations about the world. Ideas, for example, about mathematics and astronomy actually came from the Egyptians. But what we have now today that we can read are the written documents of these individuals who, again, quote unquote, invented philosophy. Now, they did so not only because they could inquire really well, but they had exceptional intellectual and observational qualities. And both of those qualities were conditioned by the use of reason and objectivity. And so what happens as all of this gets harnessed in trying to understand the world? Two things happen. One is a rejection of supernatural tales that were originally found in mythological thought and often used to explain natural phenomena, especially unusual things like great tides and tidal waves and earthquakes. Cataclysmic events are explained through mythology. Right? The gods were really upset, and that's why we were, a thunderbolt came flying down. Okay, with the invention of philosophy and scientific reasoning, there is a rejection of these kinds of tales. There is also, because of clarity, the requirement of clarity, a rejection of ambiguity in speech in favor of coherence. Again, typically when I teach this course, I bring in two books. One is a little tiny book of modern Greek to English, and the other one is a thick, probably 2.5-inch thick, massive book of ancient Greek. And that was the ancient Greek that Plato and Aristotle spoke. It is loaded with so much information and so much jargon because at the time, with the invention of the alphabet, coupled with reason and observation and an exceptional intellectual qualities and so on, observational, all of those together required that people were absolutely clear in the language. So ambiguity in language was not what was needed. It was the opposite. What do you mean? Define your terms. So this is what was going on at the particular time. Now, for the regular person, the member of the demos, all right, but the people, right, the demos, ancient Athenians really only had three questions to ask themselves: what can I know? What ought I to do? And what am I allowed to hope? Because at this point, hope was not something that was trivial. There was always the hope of things being better. And it was a connection between the desire that one had and the external world as it appeared. And imagine telling a group of people that they can no longer believe in mythological stories. The gods and goddesses will exist, but the stories that have been given are now almost irrelevant. They are useless. They will not explain the world as it presently is. What is democracy? What is a political institution? What are ethics? Mythology doesn't know. puts up his hands, collectively go, oh no. So what happens is the view of the world in ancient Athens becomes a very tragic one. Why? Because individuals are now free to act and think on their own. That's a terrifying prospect. Because gods and goddesses still exist, there is the fear that you might upset the gods. So this tragic vision becomes the precondition of philosophy itself. Because the world is tragic and chaotic, philosophy steps in to try to correct that, to rectify that disconnect between knowing about the world and having literally no control over it. And also, too, tossing up mythology makes it rather terrifying. So there is a need for rational thought because the world at that point was neither rational nor balanced, didn't matter what anybody said. And so if it were, there would be no need for philosophy. But the awareness was that it was chaotic. It was out of balance. And could we ever understand it? So because the world is chaotic, even the possibility of thought, thinking about it, coming up with predictable laws, natural laws, that in itself becomes rather problematic. So we're kind of stuck in a situation between losing mythology as a kind of a bedrock or foundational aspect of culture, and at the same time, the realization through philosophy that the world is chaotic, but there are no gods to help you. That puts people in a rather tragic situation. So the tragic, chaotic vision of the world becomes this precondition for the creation of rational thought. And it is done through self-creation, right? Self-creating knowledge, self-creation through observation, discussion, truth by consensus, something that Plato did. But while that may have been considered good, self-creation could also be threatened by other destructive significations. And one of them was hubris. And hubris, or excessive pride, was a very dangerous idea because those that, as Mark Twain used to say, light out for the territory and decide to go on their own, have no one to, at the very least, bounce ideas off of. Hey, am I doing the right thing? And so self-creation can be, on the one hand, a positive thing, such as the creation of knowledge, of human knowledge about the world, but self-creation is also about you taking matters into your own hands and stepping away from that community that Aristotle thought was so important. So hubris is dangerous, and that is also a self-creation. So self-creation is hubris, it's transgressive, it's catastrophic to the community, and that becomes the dual creation of human beings. This ability to create good, but the ability to create bad, right? To move in line with the community or destroy the community. So the ability to create is both liberating, but it's also destructive. And it is that fine line that Athenians need to basically balance. So, as you can imagine, the average person that could read, right? Because these are all written in the ancient Greek language, and people could speak the language, but very few had learned to read it. And this was something that was necessary for these ideas to be presented. So there's a sense of human insecurity and helplessness. There's a fear of divine hostility, right? That Zeus or some of the other gods and goddesses that the philosophers said still existed, but their stories were illogical or irrational. So there is the fear of divine hostility, and if you look in the slides, there's a whole range of various characters, Ate and the Daemon and the Moire, they're going to ensnare you in their trap. And there was a tremendous fear that a misstep, because remember, people are allowed to do what they want. One misstep and you're a goner, right? Or at least you would think. So guilty feelings were everywhere, especially the possibility of offending Zeus. That was horrible. To disobey Zeus would be to disobey the most important person in your existence. So as a result, various first of all, ritual behavior that would cleanse one of various ritual impurities. So taboos of one sort or another were created, often generated by these repressed desires to be free, but afraid, right? Afraid of taking the one step. So ritual behavior allowed individuals to stop being themselves and to be kind of set free temporarily, right? To engage in this behavior that would appease the gods and maybe sort of allow you to indulge periodically in other forms of behavior. Now, Puritanism is not something that is specific to ancient Greeks because that is something that continues on. In fact, we'll see that in the very last module when we talk about fundamentalism. But what is really happening here is this notion of a guilt culture, guilty of discovering knowledge, just like Eve biting into the apple. Interesting, isn't it? Because this is pre-Christian, right? Pre-Christian ideas. So a guilt culture is seen to be the result of this puritanical impulse because it creates this unconscious need for punishment. Because we are free to think and have our being, somehow this is bad. And if we're doing something that's bad, the gods are going to be really upset. So we've got to do something to appease the gods, to allow us to be intellectually free, right? Be able to use reason and objectivity, but not to offend them. So it's a very delicate balance. And this is why I call this section the return of the irrational. Because given the perspective of reason and objectivity, the response to the creation of human knowledge is a rather irrational one, because it's still so deeply linked to the fear that individuals had of the gods and goddesses still in existence. Okay, so that is essentially the highlights, the best of, right, the greatest hits of weeks 1 and 2. So I wanted to just basically do the same thing for the next two new sets, or the preceding ones. Let's try to get that right. So I'm going to do the same thing next week and go through weeks 3 and 4, and then 5 and 6. But all three of these videos, which I would like to, we're almost 27 minutes. I want to make them half an hour or less. But there's lots of really cool, interesting information in here. Please do have a look at the slides. But when you are going to study for the test, which is coming up in 2 weeks, do avail yourselves of these short videos. Certainly take notes, whatever, or you can take notes of from what you see on the screen. That's why I wanted to tuck myself in the corner. So thank you for watching that. I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll stay in touch. Next week, I'm going to also include in the video a brief discussion on the first of the 2 essays that are coming up. And that's pretty well it. 2 essays and 2 tests, because it is a compressed course. It's a lot of material. Any questions, please contact me via email, and we'll get it sorted out. Anyway, take care. Have a good long weekend, because it is July 1st tomorrow. So enjoy the weekend, and we'll see each other soon. Bye-bye.